What a wonderful turnout. Thank you for joining us. My name is Robert Carr. Welcome, everybody. I'm a research scientist here at the Center for Child and Family Policy at Duke University. Before we get started and introduce our speaker here today, Dr. Peg Burchinal, just have a few words about logistics. We are planning to have a 40-minute presentation, after which we will have a question and answer for 15 minutes. I ask that you please submit all of your questions to me via the Zoom chat function at any time during the presentation. And I will do my best to synthesize all of your questions and then present your questions to Dr. Burchinal during the Q&A at the end. Dr. Burchinal has also kindly offered to answer any important clarifying questions during the course of her presentation. So I will chime in and ask those important questions for you as they come up. So thank you. Please feel free to use the chat function, and I will be keeping track of your questions along the way. So let's get started. We are here today as part of the Early Childhood Initiative, which is established by the Center for Child and Family Policy. The goal of this initiative is to bring together scholars who are producing cutting-edge science on programs and policies affecting young children. Our speakers range across a variety of academic disciplines, but they all share a common interest in maximizing the potential of all children during the early childhood years. That is especially true of our speaker today. And it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Peg Burchinal, who is a research professor in the School of Education and Human Development at the University of Virginia. Dr. Burchinal received a PhD in quantitative psychology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She is an applied statistician who is best known for her work on childcare and early childhood education. She has served as the lead statistician and/or principal investigator for several landmark studies following children from early childhood into adulthood. This includes the Abecedarian Project study, as well as the NICHD study of early childcare and youth development. Most recently, she has served as the principal investigator of a study that is tracking children from preschool to third grade here in North Carolina, which she will talk about today. And it's no understatement to say that Peg has made a tremendous impact on our science, and that children, families, and educators are better off because of her work. And so we're just delighted to have her speak as a part of this initiative series here today. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Peg Burchinal. Thank you so much. Get away, Peg.
Thank you very much, Robert. And I really appreciate the very kind words, and also just so many of you who are my friends who are here today and with whom I've worked on much of this work. So I'm just delighted to be here today talking about preschool quality and fade out, catch up, and the implications this may have for creating more promising preschool programs. And while I'm talking, I need to acknowledge that I am speaking on the behalf of my many colleagues at the UNC Early Learning Network, the UVA Early Learning Network. I would really like to thank the study children, parents, and teachers for their participation, IES for their funding, and acknowledge that what I'm presenting is my opinion, not necessarily theirs. So what I'd like to do is take the next hour talking about some of my most recent research that I think addresses some of the concerns that have been raised recently about longer term impacts of preschool, early care, and education. So I'm going to present, very briefly, the results from 3 studies that looked at the effects, whether there are longer term direct or indirect effects of attending pre-K, and then really try to ask which pre-K practices promote the skills that show less fade out catch up. Doing this using the UNC and the UVAeln studies. So first, to really try to motivate why I think this is so important, there are studies that are raising concerns about longer term impacts. There's, of course, the Tennessee study, which provides the most rigorous pre-K evaluation. It evaluates an at-scale targeted pre-K program that met most standards for good quality. It's an RCT using a waitlist approach, and it follows almost 3,000 children through 6th grade. And at the end of the pre-K period, there were very promising results. They saw modest to moderate impacts, positive impacts on reading, math, and language, and larger impacts for DLLs and children with lower initial skills. But by third grade and then continuing through sixth grade, many of those impacts had turned negative. So they see the non-attendees doing better than the attenders on English, on math, science, discipline, and special ed in third grade. And by sixth grade, this was also true for English scores. This is very concerning, but it's even more concerning when you put it in the context of a growing literature suggesting that there's considerable fade out catch up of pre-K effects when you examine less rigorous longitudinal studies. A consensus report issued in 2017 concluded that we see a major pre-K advantage at entry to kindergarten with moderate to large impacts on reading and math, modest to moderate impacts on language skills, and a mixed pattern of findings regarding social and EF skills. But that these advantages, even in the less rigorous studies, diminish or disappear in early elementary school. However, most of this work has been done by looking at state mandated test scores using state databases. So they weren't able to examine all the different types of outcomes in those studies. In part to address this, IES funded the early learning network sites, 5 sites that followed children from pre-K through grade 3, recruiting in kindergarten a group of non-attenders who had not had preschool experience, center-based preschool experience. And when you look at the results from the UVA and the Boston studies, you see a similar kind of pattern as was reported by Tennessee, with substantial differences at entry to kindergarten, the light blue findings, with significant effects on academic, language, and EF skills, and some evidence of at UVA, and on both measures of more abstract and more rote skills, reading and math, literacy and math skills in Boston. However, when you look in the spring, you see substantial catch-up fade out on the more rote skills in particular, and especially in terms of rote literacy skills as measured by the Woodcock-Johnson or the Dibbles. So we're seeing substantial fade out, but both of these studies suggest that there's bigger fade out on these more rote skills of reading and math than on the more abstract skills of language and EF. And also that UVA suggests a disturbing pattern of growing concerns about conduct problems. So, I'd be remiss if I didn't try to include some of the, the positive findings. We see positive impacts of preschool experiences on young adult outcomes in an RCT follow-up of the Boston pre-K, in Head Start analyses conducted with some of the first cohorts of Head Start attendees by Deming, although a set of negative or null findings in follow-up cohorts. We see PSA analyses of state mandated achievement tests of some that showed that pre-K attenders did better than non-attenders. And we see evidence in longitudinal cohort studies of some positive long-term effects. Perhaps most disturbing to me is taking with those findings into context when we compare the proportion of children who had pre-K experience with achievement gaps according to the NAEP, to a nationally representative test of reading achievement, and we see similar results for math. We see that virtually no change in the discrepancies between poor and not poor children in 4th grade reading skills, despite the fact that there was a growing proportion of children, primarily low-income children, because there were targeted programs, but a growing proportion of children who had pre-K experience did not seem to change the achievement gap. So in summary, I think there are really major concerns that the field needs to be addressing, and this consortium was designed to address them, so that's a good thing. We're seeing negative impacts. We see fade out catch up, especially for more basic constrained reading and math skills, than for more abstract or unconstrained language and EF skills. And this raises major issues. Why are the pre-K impacts fading so quickly? which pre-K practices are related to gains on the outcomes that show the least fade out catch-up. So we examined these issues within the UNC and UVA Early Learning Network project data. So turning first to the question of direct effects, what kinds of direct effects do we see of attending pre-K? And I'm using effects loosely here because these are not causal studies, they're correlational studies. And if we do see fade out catch up, which hypotheses seem to be most consistent in explaining that catch up? So turning to the UNCBLM study, this is a cohort study conducted in rural North Carolina. The NC pre-K program is a targeted program that serves primarily low-income children, but also children from families that don't speak English, as well as other criteria. We recruited 63 classrooms in the 6 designated counties, and from those classrooms, 455 children. The non-attendees were recruited from the kindergarten classrooms to which the pre-K sample transitioned, and there we recorded 246 classrooms. Those children, the non-attenders, have not had any center-based preschool care according to their parents. The chart on the right shows the demographic characteristics of these 2 samples. It's a largely at-risk, high poverty group that is relatively similar except for race. We collected lots of data on these kids in the fall and spring. We measured their academic skills, their EF, and we asked the teachers to rate their social skills and self-regulation. In the winter, we observed the classrooms on 2 days, measuring the quality of teacher-child interactions using the class and measuring classroom practices using the listen. In the fall and spring, we also asked teachers to complete questionnaires that involved questions about on what they focused their instruction. So turning first to the question.
Just for a moment, I'm going to ask a question that came up in the chat.
Sure.
For important clarifying purposes. Could you just give a brief description of executive function skills and how they were measured in the study?
Okay, sure. So we use the NIH toolbox. We use the flankers test, which is a test of inhibitory control, and the DCCS, which is a test of cognitive flexibility. It's done on an iPad. This is a measure developed largely by Philip Zanlano and his colleagues. And it gets at the flankers test, the degree to which you can inhibit a primary response, and the cognitive flexibility, the extent to which you can shift your cognitive framework. So when we asked whether there was fade out, again, looking at the differences between the attendees and the non-attenders in the fall and the springs, fall being dark blue, spring being light blue, we see substantial differences in the fall on language, math, and reading. But by spring, we see that the differences in reading have totally disappeared, that there's significant declines in the effect sizes for reading and math, but we continue to see effects on language, math, and the effect size on EF, on the cognitive flexibility, has actually increased to become significant. So then we really wanted to ask, okay, so we do see fade out. Why are we seeing fade out? And we wanted to examine 3 hypotheses. The first one is the trifecta hypothesis put forth by UVAeln and colleagues, which really says that we should see long-term effects for interventions when they teach foundational skills that are malleable, that are not the primary focus of subsequent instruction or subsequent interventions. The differential sustaining environments hypothesis, which says that children with pre-K experiences are moving from relatively high quality programs, oftentimes into school providing less quality, and that this will matter more for them. The lower quality will matter more for them than for non-attendees. And the redundant instruction hypothesis, which states that pre-K and kindergarten teachers are teaching the same skills, so the children who get it a second time around show less gain. We examined these questions from our classroom observation data. The class measures the quality of teacher-child interactions. We use the standard protocol. So listen measures what, classroom practices. Each child is observed for 5 minutes every 30 seconds. The observer records the type of language exchanges they experience. At the end of the 5 minutes, you record the settings and activities that that child experienced. And then you move on to the next target child. You do this until all target children are observed. And then you cycle back through for a total of 4 observations per child, providing 20 minutes of observation per children. These were combined across children to create classroom level measures as well as child level measures. So using these data, we examined these 3 hypotheses regarding FAGAP. Turning first to the trifecta skills hypothesis, there's no analysis that's necessary, but we did see the largest catch up in reading and math, which are the substantial focus of what happens in kindergarten and subsequently, and sustained differences in language and EF, which are not. So we concluded that our results are consistent with the trifecta hypothesis. When we looked at the differential sustaining environment hypothesis, we saw no support for this hypothesis. There was no evidence of quality by pre-K interactions that accounted for catch-up, and our 4 measures, based on our 4 measures of quality, which were class, school level proficiency, and the proportion of instruction that involved advanced content. We looked at the redundant hypothesis, a redundant instructions hypothesis, and again, we saw no support for this hypothesis. Despite the fact we saw considerable overlap, the level of overlap did not contribute to predicting how much the child gained in terms of their skills in that area, or how little they gained. So in conclusion, we decided that our results seem to support the trifecta hypothesis. And this is consistent with other studies that have really focused on calling this a constrained, unconstrained skill hypothesis. But perhaps there are different implications, because the trifecta approach would really suggest that in preschool, we really want to focus on skills that are not taught later, whereas the constrained, unconstrained skills hypothesis has really, that those advocates have really argued for embedding teaching the constrained skilled in content-rich curricula. When we look at the differential sustaining environment, our results are not surprising, given that that's exactly what Drew Bailey found in his meta-analysis. And when we look at our findings regarding redundant instruction, we argue this study may be the first to directly test this, and that despite considerable overlap in instruction, this too did not seem to account for catch-up. Okay, so the second study I want to talk about really asks the question, is there any evidence of indirect effects of pre-K of access to pre-K? So some people have argued that having proportionately more pre-K children in a classroom will up the ante in terms of instruction, because the teacher will be teaching to a more skilled set of children. Others have argued that you should see peer effects, in terms of where we tend to see peer effects are both on language skills and positively. So having peers with more language skills, with higher levels of language skills, seems to improve a target child's language skills, but also negatively in terms of behavior problems. So having more peers with behavior problems is related to the target child being more likely to show behavior problems. So we examined this hypothesis using the UVAeln Study, which focuses on Fairfax County in Virginia. They were able to recruit almost all of the attendees from the Fairfax pre-K program in the fall of 2016 and followed them forward, providing a sample of about 1,400 children. They recruited children from the kindergarten class, among the kindergarten classmates of the pre-K attendees, resulting in samples of about 1,200 non-attendees. This is a diverse group, and it's primarily low income. So when we looked at the results, first we asked, does having more pre-K attendees is it related to the quality of the school experience or the classroom experience? We see schools with more pre-K attendees tended to be more diverse, and they can be more likely to be high poverty and have more ELL children. Their teachers reported less focus on teacher, parent, home learning in those schools and in schools with fewer pre-K attendees. The classroom, we see some evidence for the hypothesis that having more pre-K attenders will change the quality of the classroom, where we see higher class instructional support, more literacy instruction, and more abstract instruction related to proportion of the class that attended pre-K. But when we look at child outcomes and look at the proportion of pre-K given whether the child was a pre-K attender and fall scores and demographic characteristics, we find that the proportion of pre-K is not related to academic skills. It's not related to behavior problems, but it's related to slightly larger gains in language skills and declines in frustration tolerance. So in conclusion, and trying to put this in the context of the general literature, the study found that, not surprisingly, since this is a targeted program, high poverty schools have more pre-K attendees, that classroom quality might be slightly higher when there are more pre-K attenders in the classroom, that children show slightly larger gains in language skills and more frustration, but also more frustration. And this to us suggests that these are indirect effects, likely through pure effects, not through changes in classroom instruction because of the specific outcomes that were affected. Discussing this relative to some of the other studies, it provides some support for claims that having more pre-K attenders will change the quality of the classrooms, but we did not find that it related to gains in academic skills, as had been claimed in some of the other studies, or that it was related to increases in problem behaviors. Okay, sorry, I'm going very quickly, but the third study is perhaps the most important one given this context. So we really wanted to know which preschool practices seem to be promoting the outcomes that show less fade out catching, because that really seems to be what we need to know in order to make preschool more effective at preparing children for subsequent succeeding in school, especially given the fact that we're not finding that it seems to be the quality of the subsequent schooling experiences that account for fade out catch up. Okay, so again, using the UNCBLM study, in this case, we focus on the 361 children who were recruited in the fall and who have spring outcomes. This number is smaller than the 455 children we followed into kindergarten, because at the end of fall data collection, we realized we were going to need a much bigger sample to weather likely attrition, and we supplemented the sample by over 100 children. But we didn't have all data, so we weren't able to look at gains, fall to spring gains in their outcome, and therefore really try to look at how much learning they had in pre-K. Okay, so again, same way of measuring child outcomes as described above. We asked whether 4 different ECE dimensions of quality predicted child outcomes. We focused on the quality of teacher-child interactions as measured by the class, the degree to which children experienced high-quality teacher-child language exchanges that involve decontextualized language, teacher elaborations, or 3 or more turns in a conversation, sustained conversations. We looked at the time spent in content-specific instructional activities and the proportion of time spent in large group activities, believing this may be developmentally inappropriate for 4-year-olds. So turning first to the class, we see that within our sample, we see moderately good quality teacher-child interactions. When we look at what was happening in terms of practices in the classroom, we see on average, these children were spending 35% of their time in large group activities, 25% of their time in literacy activities, 15% of their time in math activities, but only 4% of the time did they experience high quality teacher-child language exchanges. And this even counted the amount of time that teachers spent talking to the large group. So very little high quality teacher-child language exchanges. Okay, so we did HLM analyses looking at fall to spring gains in child outcomes from the quality dimensions. And very briefly, we see a very mixed pattern in terms of the class. We, not surprisingly, find that children who experience more complex teacher talk showed larger gains in language. The children who experience more direct instruction and decoding skills showed larger gains in decoding skills. But I think the most important take-home message from this study is we're seeing our biggest predictor was proportion of time spent in large group activities. This was a negative predictor of gains in language and math skills, and a marginally negative predictor of gains in cognitive, in inhibitory control and decoding skills. So in conclusion, the study suggests that there are different outcomes are related to different quality measures, that if we want gains in language, it suggests we really should reduce the amount of time spent in large group instruction, and we should ask teachers to spend more time in rich language interchanges with the children. No idea why we see a negative relationship between the class and EF. When we look at gains in academic skills, we see that this was related to time spent in direct instruction, to higher class scores, and less time spent in whole group instruction. We did not find that gains in social skills were related to any of our quality dimensions, but it's important to point out that our sample size was limited and we were looking at gain scores, which has less power. And that we see the kinds of effect sizes for the class that have been significant in other, as a positive predictor, that have been significant in other studies. If we put this in the context of other studies, there are lots of other studies that suggest that the class is a modest predictor of gains in language and literacy skills, that time in academic activities, which is largely large group activities, is positively related to reading, but negatively related to behavior problems. But negatively related behavior is related to decreases in social skills and increases in behavior problems. And we find a very large literature that suggests that rich language interchanges are related to gains in language. And that, I just wanted to add some other practices that we were not able to examine in our study, but we think should be considered as we think about what kinds of practices may improve children's skills. And one of the ones that has been really implicated is negative punitive behavior management. And this has been shown to be negatively related to inhibitory control and self-regulation, among other skills. And that context-rich and cognitively demanding instruction is positively related to outcomes, especially math. So thinking about both the context and the recent findings and the results from these studies, I think there are various conclusions that I draw. And I have to say, this is my conclusion, not necessarily even those of my colleagues, which is that, first of all, teaching rote skills in pre-K is ineffective. They make large gains while in pre-K, but those gains almost completely disappear in the first year of public school in kindergarten. Kindergarten seems to be very effective at teaching these rather boring things, so maybe we should just let kindergarten do it. And it might even be potentially harmful, as indicated by results from just some studies that suggest that amount of time in academic instruction was related to increases in behavior problems. So we see much larger evidence of fade out on these skills than on the more abstract skills. So I would argue that we should really, and that this, when we put this in the context of the fact that teachers right now in pre-K spend more time teaching literacy skills than any other academic area. And I ask whether this time could be used more productively in trying to promote some of these more abstract skills. They do not seem to be promoted as well once children get to school. Some of the classroom practices that promote these abstract skills include sustained rich teacher-child conversations, very limited use of large group activity didactic instruction, where some professionals are recommending that large group instruction sessions involving large group instruction should be limited to 10 minutes or less, that it's really developmentally inappropriate to expect 4-year-olds to be able to sit for more than 10 minutes in a large group, and that positive, not punitive behavior management also seems to be promoting these more abstract skills. This raises questions about whether we have effective professional development that directly focuses on promoting these skills. And it also raises some questions that are far outside the scope of the studies that I've been involved with about whether placing classrooms in public schools is part of the problem, because if they're in public schools, can they avoid the inevitable push down of focus on these academic skills? So I would like to thank you all, and I would love to address questions. And thank you all for listening so well.
Thank you, Peg. Thank you so much. We do have a few clarifying questions that came in that I'll follow up with on first before getting to some bigger picture questions. Just on this point about whole group instruction, at the end, you mentioned a no more than 10 minutes per day is a recommendation. Could you just say a little bit more from your data? What was the kind of range of time in whole group instruction that you saw?
We saw it range anywhere from 10 minutes to some children had whole group instruction for all of the time we observed them. So what we did tend to see with our data is class teachers either tended to have a lot of whole group instruction or a lot of center-based activities. But when they were focused, and I want to distinguish between whole group and large group. So in our study, large group was 10 or more children. So it wasn't necessarily the whole classroom.
So that could be small groups with not the whole classroom, but 10 or more kids.
Right.
Center. That could also be center time, and quite a bit of variability.
But it was, any group where having the kind of sustained interactions with any one child is almost impossible.
A related question, you said a little bit about how literacy instruction was measured by the Listen tool in those classrooms. It was an observational tool that you used. Could you just say a little bit more about what that measure was capturing specifically in terms of literacy instruction? Did it include playful interactions around literacy instruction? Was it more focused on code related or meaning focused instruction? What did the Listen literacy instruction get at?
So the literacy instruction that was used to relate to the Woodcock-Johnson letter word, our more global measure of reading involved book reading. It involved direct instruction on decoding skills. So it involved anything that was either that involved any type of literacy activity. The one that the measure that we looked at relative to gains on our measure of decoding skills only focused on activities that were teaching decoding skills, letter sound recognition, phonemic awareness, those kinds of things.
Okay, great. A few more nuanced questions before we get to the big picture ones. Greg Duncan has two questions. I am going to ask the first questions, and I will ask the second one as well. But Peg, in the North Carolina ELN study, effects on executive function were increasing, you showed, during the period of time between the fall of kindergarten and the spring of kindergarten, while effects on reading, math, and other more academic content areas were decreasing during that period. Your paper talks a little bit about why that might be the case, some floor effects potentially in the fall of kindergarten. Could you just say a little bit more about, is it measurement why we're seeing an increase in the effect of pre-K on executive function, or is it an actual phenomena that we should be interested in understanding?
I can't say. I mean, we had major floor effects. I mean, the NIH toolbox claimed that it was appropriate for 4-year-olds and older, but many of our 4-year-olds really struggled with understanding the instructions. And we had major floor, they were not able to get beyond the trial period. So there were a lot of zeros. So I worry more that we very well might be seeing a measurement issue here.
Nonetheless, you are seeing positive maintained effects of pre-K participation at the end of kindergarten on those EF measures, perhaps when kids are actually able to perform well on those tasks or well enough.
So I trust the kindergarten, I trust the kindergarten EF results much more than I do the pre-K EF results.
Great.
Because in kindergarten, most of the children were able to do the tasks and at least got a score, got beyond the trial period, the training period.
Great. I just wanted to ask that because it is so central to this trifecta skills hypothesis. Perhaps we're seeing sustained effects on measures that, become better measures over time as children develop and progress through school. But nonetheless, we do think our measures of literacy, math, social skills are good predictors, either at the end of preschool or years later. So a few big picture questions around your recommendations and thinking about instruction versus curriculum. I'm just going to read these verbatim. So Lily Moffat has a great question. She's wondering if we should be promoting specific practices, instructional practices among teachers, or if we should be promoting a specific curriculum instead. Coaching teachers on practices does not seem to work so much, Lily says, if it isn't tied to a curriculum. So this question around embedding professional development instruction within a specific curriculum versus more generally around practices that promote development.
So that is a wonderful question. That is the $1 million question that I'm not sure I have data to address that question, because the studies that I've been involved with have primarily, have almost exclusively used creative curriculum in their classrooms, which probably doesn't meet the definition of, a really strong curriculum. I do think there is, there's some evidence that, for example, if you look at the Chicago School Readiness Study, that promoting positive non-punitive behavior management can be effective. And, the READY study has shown that it can be adapted into developmentally appropriate curriculum and have long-term effects. So I think that the question of whether you focus on the specific practices or whether you try, what I worry about is when you really try to do it in the context of a curriculum, the things that curriculum really needs to make sure that it's focusing on some of these things that we just that we would argue from developmental theory are really important for young children, which are things like, having supportive, positive interactions with caregivers, and doing that at the individual child level, which really needs to at a minimum, we need to ensure that no child is being targeted for harsh, punitive kinds of interactions with their teachers. And all children should be talked with. Teachers should be having conversations with their children, with the 4-year-olds. And that almost never happens. And, so maybe some of these curricula know how to promote that. Maybe it's just something that's very hard to get preschool teachers to know how to do. But it would be just wonderful if we could figure out a way make that happen.
In answering that question, you've also answered Greg Duncan's second question, which asked about how well creative curriculum is promoting the type of interactions that you would want to see in preschool classrooms. I think the answer is the questionable there. You're not an expert on Boston pre-K's curriculum, but from what you know about the kind of curriculum that they're developing in Boston, to what extent do you think it is promoting the type of interactions that you would want to see in preschool classrooms?
From what I've read, it is very good at promoting positive behavior management. It's very good at promoting conversations and creating a, I do think that even the only issue I have with the Boston pre-K conclusions is the fact that they continue to argue that we really should be teaching these more rote skills within, embedding them within a context-rich curriculum. And even they are seeing substantial fade outs on those skills. So, I think that if we could develop a curriculum that does not involve focusing on those skills, we might do even better.
Okay, so I'm happy to get to some big quick picture questions here as well. I'll start off by saying that context really matters and that you've focused on two really important contexts here, rural North Carolina and Fairfax, Virginia. Your findings show some consistency and inconsistency with the published research. Just thinking about how much we can expect to see variability across contexts in some of the findings that you've shown here versus how much may some of these findings may be universal across early childhood programs across the nation. Is there any speculation that you can offer about that?
Okay, so again, I'm speaking way beyond my data, but I think that our data, there's some things that I really think we are just seeing so consistently that we really need to pay attention to them. Whether it's the Tennessee study, whether it's the ELN follow-up, or even whether it's the studies that involve comparisons of attendees and non-attendees in state mandated test data, statewide school test data, blah, blah, blah. Sorry. And that is that we really are seeing evidence that we see large fade out in reading and math and reading skills in particular and math skills as well. And I think we really need to take this in the context of understanding what it is that as children move from first to second to third grade, they move from learning these very basic rote skills into learning how to apply them and use them in more abstract ways. And so by focusing on these rote skills, we're focusing on contributing to the child's ability to do one part of what will be required of them later. But unfortunately, we're focusing on the part that kindergarten does a good job of already teaching them those skills. Kindergarten does a really good job of teaching children those basic skills. Some people would argue it's even developmentally inappropriate in kindergarten to do that. But if it's developmentally inappropriate in kindergarten, it's clearly developmentally inappropriate in pre-K. So I would say they're across the range of the literature I know about, focusing on promoting the kinds of skills that are measured by early measures of reading and math has not been productive. It has not changed NAEP scores. I really, I'm inferring it hasn't changed NAEP scores. I think we really need to rethink that at a minimum. So so I feel relatively confident about that. Where I really worry about context and measurement is in things like the EF skills. Everybody measures EF differently. I really think we should not, we asked too much of those measures when we applied we asked too much of our kids when we tried to administer those measures to them as 4-year-olds. So I'm really not, I don't feel nearly as confident about drawing conclusions from my data about what promotes EF skills. it's pretty clear from the little bit I know that trying to directly teach these skills has not been effective, but trying to, that we know that, but exactly what promotes them, I think there's a whole lot of other people out there who are much more knowledgeable than me about how that happens. So sorry, I've forgotten the rest of my train of conversation, of thought there.
Let me chime in with something that Ellen commented, Ellen Peisner-Feinberg, and this is going to hurt us all a little bit, but what you're concluding here, Peg, and what your study is showing us is perhaps something that the field has been talking about for several decades now, ever since some of these early studies of early care and education that were done. Ellen is saying the difficulty is that we're still saying it, right? So moving beyond your study, your data, what is going to affect change, and what is going to affect thinking more critically about what we can actually do to use the evidence and the science to improve preschool classrooms. Not sure that's a question or just a wandering.
I mean, I think I agree. I mean, almost none of the findings were horribly surprising, and they almost all are the kinds of things people have worried about. I do worry that, we kind of move from one model to another. And what we really need to do is make sure that we know what the evidence is for each of the models. So we move from a focus on following the child, child-centered childcare. Many of you are too young to remember that, but, and then we move from there to this idea of intentional teaching, and really adopted this model of structural quality leads to process quality, leads to child outcomes, and we really focus almost exclusively on those dimensions and really stop looking at things like practices. So how can we, now that we're, I think, really at a moment where, given that there's such incredibly large expenditures, both at the state and the federal level, and the potential of more expenditures in the future, can we use this moment to say, let's at least try to learn from the research, from the evaluations, and think about how we can do things differently. And if nothing else, do no harm. I mean, maybe we're trying too hard to do good, and in the process, we may be doing harm. So at a minimum, can we make preschool something that is, again, fun for kids, where they get to go and play and have the kinds of interchanges with each other and with their teachers that I might be looking for for my grandchildren, if my children never have children, but, and for those of you who are younger who are looking for your children, and stop trying to make it something that fixes the child. And if we are going to fix the child, at least let's fix it effectively.
So all the questions I've asked you so far have pertained to what preschools can be doing differently, or how things are being done during preschool. Let me ask you about kindergarten and later grades as well. And this is the sustaining environments hypothesis that we are seeing, even in studies that you shared with us today, we are seeing positive short-term effects of participating in a high-quality preschool program. But something happens during kindergarten and those effects diminish. Trifecta hypothesis is saying that it's really the skills that preschool programs are focusing on. Sustaining environments hypothesis is saying that it's the experiences that kids subsequently have in kindergarten. You've taken a pretty comprehensive look at 4 dimensions of kindergarten interactions that have taken place here and don't find any support. Your findings are generally consistent with the literature. Before we totally close the book on the sustaining environments hypothesis, is there anywhere else that we should look in terms of the experiences that kids are having in kindergarten that may lead to sustaining these impacts? In the chat here, Judy Carta is asking about multi-tiered systems of support, right? Our measures of sustaining environment so typically focus on school proficiency or academic proficiency. You've really extended it into a number of new dimensions. Might there be other dimensions that we should explore, multi-tiered systems of support?
I mean, I think, so this again is out, so many of you are so much more expert in what happens in schools than I am, that I feel a little abashed in trying to talk about this. I mean, I think there are several conclusions that we can draw from the state of the literature. One is good practices are good for all children, whether you attended pre-K or not. And maybe the framing of this question itself was a little short-sighted. So why is it that we think that pre-K attenders would benefit more if they move into high quality elementary schools than non-attenders? So, I mean, across the different studies, and I think in Drew's meta-analysis in particular, he does see positive effects for all children if they experience higher qualities, elementary school experiences. But and I do think if we could encourage teachers to do more differentiation, maybe we would actually see this. But given what we ask of teachers right now, it seems very unlikely that's going to happen on a large scale. I mean, from what happened in North Carolina, I think in many states, is that once children moved into kindergarten, they were doing standards-based instruction rather than curriculum-based instruction. And so the teachers were having to develop their own instructional activities. And so if we then ask teachers not only to develop the activities that are linked to the standards, but then also develop the activities that will both boost the children who don't even meet the standards of, and promote the children who exceed the standards. That's asking an awful lot of somebody who, at least in North Carolina, does not get paid very much.
This leads me to,
I think,
go ahead.
Go ahead. I mean, I think things like multi-tiered systems are great, but I don't think I don't know that they would necessarily benefit pre-K attenders more than other children. So I think we really, for the differential sustaining environments hypothesis, we need to really ask, why is it we think pre-K attenders would benefit more?
I think part of your work is showing, in terms of research design, is showing what would happen if we shifted a population of kids from staying at home to attending a preschool program, and then what kind of experiences subsequently would really matter for those kids once we made that shift. And we're not seeing a lot of evidence of factors in kindergarten in particular in your studies that really make that specific difference. But important point, a lot of the measures of subsequent kindergarten experience that you looked at did benefit all of the kids, regardless of whether or not they were pre-K attendees or not. So something good is happening in kindergarten based off some of the measures that you've looked at. We have just 5 minutes left. I'm wondering if I should ask another big question or pivot to a more nuanced study design question. Let me ask the big picture question. Why is it that we have such a fractured system, even in rural North Carolina, even this very specific context? Why is it that the differences in experiences that kids have across these two grade levels, which are sometimes often housed within the same building? What is it that what is it that we need to overcome to perhaps maybe align experiences across these grade levels? What is the future of having a large scale pre-K system look like in trying to fit it in with public schools?
I'm going to punt on that question because this is really not one I am an expert to answer. But what I would like to segue into is, I think that the pandemic really showed how critical early care and education is for parents of young children and for the economy in general, and the degree to which, really trying to address these issues is going to be really important to the recovery of this country in general and to families with young children. So I think that the fractured system has happened because in my opinion, in this country, we have required that early childhood be the purview of parents. And we have tagged everything that is done to provide services that parents don't pay for to the wages typically to the wages that the center-based programs, community-based programs, the kinds of wages that are offered there, oftentimes. But anyway, I think that we have a system that doesn't work. And the pandemic has really demonstrated how it doesn't work, because parents can't afford to pay more. Programs therefore can't provide wages to teachers that will support their staff. Therefore, they're not being able to provide care to as many children. And therefore parents are not able to work or go to school. And so I think that we need to factor that into our conversation. Not only do we need to fix this fractured system of all the different providers, all the different standards, but we really need to take into account that we need to do this in the context of creating a system where it will be possible to provide stable, good quality care for all children.
Peg, I think in punting on my question, you've hit a field goal and answered it in part. So I appreciate that. We just have 2 minutes left. I'll leave it up to you to say any concluding comments, and also mention that I'm getting a lot of comments here in the chat of people saying that you did a great job and this was a great presentation. Really appreciate it.
Okay, well, first of all, I just again would like to say thank you to Robert and Erica and Ken and everybody at Duke for inviting me. It was this wonderful opportunity to really try to pull together a consensus view from the disparate work that I've been doing over the last 5 years. And it really gave me a wonderful opportunity to really try to think across these studies within the context of the field, which I really think is at a tipping point. I mean, I think the pandemic has revealed deep fissures that impact families, and fortunately, they impact families to whom policymakers pay attention. So, I think we are hopefully moving into a period where early care and education can start trying to do some different things with different models and really focus on on making the programs both more effective, but also perhaps more developmentally appropriate.
Thank you, Peg. These are important messages and important take-home points, and a lot of us will take them to heart. Thank you. I'm going to do my due diligence here and wrap up. We're at 1:30. I do want to thank everybody for joining us today. We do welcome your feedback. We sent out a survey link in the chat. If you click on it, you can take a few minutes to share your opinions with us. I'd also like to invite you to a conference that the Center for Child and Family Policy will be hosting in April. The focus of that conference will be next steps in early childhood policy, creating a universal system of care for families with young children. This is a national Zoom event on April 12th, and then the following day on April 13th, it will be an in-person conference here at Duke in North Carolina, focused on North Carolina in particular. Please register for both of those events. For the second one, if you're here in North Carolina, that info should be in the chat and on our websites. And I will leave you off here with just taking an extra minute of your time. And I do really appreciate you all joining us today. We had over 50 participants here at some point, and I know there were a lot of familiar faces and interested parties here. So thank you, Peg.